Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute for everyone to join, and then we will get started with today's presentation. Okay, we will go ahead and get started. So thank you for joining us today for working with deaf survivors of sexual violence with Sabrina Glover from Pathways for Change. My name is Charlotte Hoff, and I am the Communications and Training Coordinator at MOVA. I am just going to go over some logistics quickly before passing it over to our presenter. First of all, this is a Zoom webinar, so you cannot be seen or heard as audience members, but you can see the presenter, ASL interpreters, and presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of the Zoom screen to ask them. Questions will be saved until the end of the presentation and will all be answered then. We do have ASL interpretation and CART captioning during today's workshop. To see the closed captions, go to the bottom of the screen, click the up arrow next to closed captions, and choose Show Subtitle. If you are having any troubles, any technical issues today, please use the chat function to message all panelists, and someone will happily help you. Now I'm really excited to introduce our presenter for today. Sabrina Glover is the Assistant Director of Deaf Services at Pathways for Change, where her work is focused on providing education and services for deaf and hard of hearing survivors of sexual violence in Massachusetts. She holds a master's in deaf education and was a teacher of the deaf for a number of years. Sabrina is now an adjunct professor at several colleges and universities where she teaches courses on American Sign Language and deaf studies. She is deaf herself, and her passion is advocating for the deaf and disabled communities through education. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sabrina. I'll pass it over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that introduction. So I was planning to cover some of that, but you did it for me, so thank you. Okay, so let's get started. This is me. As Charlotte already said nicely in that introduction, I'm your presenter today. And this gives you my contact information. I will provide this again at the end. So feel free to email me if you'd like to make contact after today. Also, for anyone who may be blind or deafblind in the audience, I'd like to give a visual description of what's on the screen and also myself. So basically, it's a presenter slide with a picture of me from a few years ago. I might look a little bit younger in this picture than I do live with you today. And if any of you are parents, you understand where I'm coming from, right? We all have gotten older, especially in the last couple of years. But in this picture, I have my hair down and it's long and wavy. Today, I'm here with my hair up. I'm wearing a black top, and I'm on a screen that shows me from just the torso up to the top of my head, and I'm wearing my glasses today. So that gives you a visual description. Also, as Charlotte has already mentioned, I work at an agency called Pathways for Change Incorporated, and it is a rape crisis center in serving the state of Massachusetts, and there is a program serving deaf survivors statewide. So we serve all deaf and hard of hearing survivors who live within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Here is a list of some services provided in the program. We have 24/7 video phone hotline, and that's for crisis phone call purposes. We also provide information and referral through that hotline. We have legal, medical, court, police, accompaniment. So basically what that means is if an individual is a survivor and they open a case based on their sexual violence experience, or they may need assistance and support with getting legal assistance or appearing in court, any interaction with the police. It's basically emotional support, having a second person there who they can communicate well with in their communication mode or language that works for them, for their support and comfort level. So oftentimes individuals need to go to the hospital as well for a SANE kit. That's another instance where crisis counseling and support and just company during such a difficult time can really make a big difference for people. Police accompaniment, it has to do with issues like a report being filed or any follow-up. Sometimes people need support during those situations. Next is referrals. So we receive a lot of phone calls where people need different types of assistance. Possibly they're looking for a shelter. They might need access to equipment, various types of treatment or therapies. So we provide that one-stop shopping, so to speak, for referrals of that nature. We also have counseling services, and we have counselors who are ASL fluent, and that can be in person or via Zoom. We also provide support groups at Pathways. And professional consultation refers to making connections with other agencies who may have specialized services that is needed by a particular consumer, but they need that technical assistance around the accessibility piece for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. So we can give that type of consultation and technical assistance to other agencies and service providers. We can also help people with equipment where we know about donation programs and other ways to access equipment. Deaf people use technology like fire alarm signals that are visual, baby crier devices, all types of visual signalers or vibrating signalers for various accessibility needs that deaf and hard of hearing people face. So sometimes individuals involved with domestic violence situations or sexual violence situations need to move quickly. And so they need to have access to that safety equipment as well. We also provide training, webinars, and classes. And typically these are focused on health and well-being for students in the 4th or 5th grade all the way through high school. So we teach about health, issues like consent, relationship issues, friendship conflicts, and so forth. So we try to educate deaf youth. And these are a lot of the services that people can access. So I'd like to go back to some of these in more detail later in my talk. But first, I wanted to start with who I am and where I work and what we do. So you have an idea of where deaf survivors can reach out and the type of support that they can get through our agency. So any presentation like this that I give, I start off thinking about my audience. And I think possibly there are members of the audience who may not be familiar with the deaf community. There may be some who are, but if this is your first time seeing a presentation by a deaf presenter, I would like to first address some common myths about the deaf community, because there are often misperceptions out there, and some of you may have some of these myths. And so let me just dispel them right away, because in the future, if you come in contact with clients, survivors who need your services, who are deaf, it might help you better serve them if you're aware of some of these myths that are very common in the deaf community. So let me just go through these. The first one that is very common is that all deaf people are alike in that experience of being deaf. So that means you might think they all have the same hearing level or that we all communicate in the same way. And that's not the case. There are so many different ways of being deaf. So for example, there are some deaf people who are ASL users, like I am, and are considered culturally deaf. So my primary language is American Sign Language, and I am a culturally deaf person. But there are other deaf people who don't know sign language and don't use it. They may use spoken language, and they might want you to write in written English to help them better understand what you're saying. There are also people who are hard of hearing. That's a group that uses their residual hearing, and that's a wide range. Some people use amplification like hearing aids. Some hard of hearing people know sign language, some don't. So there's a lot of variation within that very large group. And then late deafened refers to people who could hear in early childhood and became deaf later. And some of those individuals do learn American Sign Language, some don't. Then we have the group who's referred to as deaf-blind, and those are people who are both deaf as well as blind, but just as hearing loss varies, so does the vision loss. So that can range from someone who has some hearing loss and some vision loss. So that would be a hard of hearing person with low vision, all the way to someone who may be completely deaf and completely blind, and any combination of those two identities. And then deaf disabled refers to people who are deaf and have other disabilities as well. So you may encounter a deaf wheelchair user, or someone who has an intellectual disability and is also deaf. Maybe a deaf person who is autistic. So as you can see on this list, there are many different deaf experiences out there in the community. No two deaf people are alike. So do keep that in mind. If you meet one deaf person, you have met one deaf person, because everybody is a unique individual, and there are many subgroups within the deaf community. This is another common myth about the deaf community, that lip reading is a reasonable expectation, that deaf people do lip read and that it's a feasible strategy for communication access. But actually, it's been shown with research that even the best lip readers can only see about 30% of information on the lips. So many sounds look alike or happen deep within the mouth that they aren't actually visible on the lips. So lip reading involves a lot of guesswork, and there is quite a lot of room for misunderstandings. And so oftentimes when we encounter other people who don't know sign language and are hearing, they ask right away, do you read lips? And that really puts the onus on the deaf individual. So if you encounter a deaf person, instead of asking, can you accommodate my needs, by saying, do you read lips? Ask them how you can accommodate their needs for communication access. And that puts the onus on you as the service provider rather than them as the person seeking support. So it's just a different way of framing that assumption. We're going to switch interpreters now.
And another common myth about the deaf community is that deaf people cannot speak, but that also depends. There are some people who can speak, and there are some people who cannot speak. So there's a range. Some people are really fluent in speaking, and other people might be a little less fluent. It all depends. Some people know how to speak, but they exercise the right not to speak because they might not feel comfortable. And many deaf people have gone through speech training throughout the years. And so you can't make any assumptions if someone can speak or not. It's their personal preference if they'd like to. Another myth is that all deaf people know sign language, and that's also not true. One interesting fact, though, is that around 30 million Americans in the country either identify as hard of hearing or deaf. That's 30 million, so that's a lot of people. But out of that amount of people, how many people know sign language? Maybe around 35 to 50,000. So that's a small number considering the population. There are more hearing people in this country that know sign language than deaf people. So that's a wild statistic, but it's true. So you can't make the assumption that every deaf person knows how to sign. So you just don't make assumptions and ask them, how can I accommodate you? What do you prefer for your mode of communication? Another common myth is that sign language is universal. And if you go to another country, they speak a different language than we do in America. And much like sign language, it's not universal. So each country has their own sign language. We do in America have regional sign language, much like there are accents and dialects. And I'll go into that a little bit later in a further slide. This is also a myth that deaf people can't hear. Some can. Some identify as hard of hearing. Some of them have a cochlear implant. So just be careful with what you say around a deaf person because you never know if they have residual hearing or not. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So the last myth that I want to talk about is that deaf people are unable to report abuse because they can't communicate or don't have language. So that's basically dispowering the deaf person. We do have our own language, that's a fact. We do have our own culture, that's a fact. But the systems that have been in place have barriers to our access for making reports like this. And again, I will go into this a little bit later in a further slide. So before I jump into the topic of sexual violence in the deaf community, I want to take a step back and just paint a little picture about what the deaf community has gone through. The deaf community has experienced language deprivation, and maybe some of you are familiar with the concept of it. I'll try to keep this brief, but language deprivation basically means when a baby is born and through the toddler years, let's say between 2, 3, 4 years old, during this time frame, there's this window of opportunity that babies can learn language. And if there's no language exposure after that age range, their ability to learn this language becomes impacted. And they don't learn as normal children that would be exposed to the language, their language would learn. So keep that in the back of your mind as well. So if there's no access or exposure to language during these formative years, then it dramatically impacts the rest of their life. And they could have cognitive delays, fluency delays in language, behavioral and mental health issues. And in the hearing community, this is rare because you're constantly exposed to sound, to language, to whatever's going on in the background, radio, television, songs, people talking, indirect communication. You're constantly being exposed to language, and you might not realize you're picking up language and acquiring the language, but it's happening. And with deaf people, if they're not exposed to the language during these formative years, they are language deprived. And that's unfortunate that it does happen, but it is a norm in the deaf community. So that leads to statistics that look like this. 90 to 95% of deaf and hard of hearing children have hearing parents. That's a large number. That might be surprising to some of you. Another common myth is that most deaf children have deaf parents, but that's not the case. Most deaf children are born of hearing parents. So a very high percentage of deaf children have hearing parents. And 70 to 80% of those parents do not learn sign language, or they're not fluent enough in sign language to have meaningful conversations and communication. And that also plays into the language deprivation that we suffer as a community. The lifelong effects of language deprivation include cognitive difficulties, emotional challenges, isolation, mental health issues, behavioral issues, illiteracy and struggles in school, suicide attempts, joblessness and underemployment, and child abuse and sexual abuse, which I'll get into today. So these are some serious effects, all that stem from language deprivation. And sexual violence happens in the deaf community a lot more than it happens in the hearing community. And we have to go back and look at the root causes. And it does stem from language deprivation and not having access to language and communication. And that also leads to people reporting these issues of sexual violence less. So to start talking about sexual violence in the deaf community, it's estimated that 50% of the community has been sexually abused as a child, which is a very sad statistic. Deaf survivors often struggle to define their experience, or they label these experiences as miscommunication or bad sex. And this is because they haven't had the access to the language. They don't know if it's bad or if it's a miscommunication. No one's taught them the difference between the two. And the majority of deaf survivors don't label partner perpetrated sexual coercion as an abusive act. So at the Rape Crisis Center, we have counselors and services, and I would say about 5% of deaf sexual assault survivors will actually report their assault to the police. And those are some of the reasons why. And just a reminder, I want to go back to the last slide, that there are some systemic barriers that are in place right now that exacerbate this. We have language deprivation, systemic barriers to access to treatment and services, how you identify with what's occurred in your life. And we'll get into that a little bit later too. So this is a nice visual tool, this wheel. It talks about power and control. And I'll go through the wheel and explain what it means. Half of this talks about physical violence, and the other half of it talks about sexual violence. And there are little pieces of the pie, different colors and different pictures within the pie chart. One of them talks about intimidation. The other one talks about verbal and emotional abuse. The other one talks about isolation. And the other one talks about minimizing, denying, and blaming. You'll see some pictures of white hearing men that are privileged. There are some people that talks about financial abuse, talks about forced threat. And this applies to domestic and sexual violence survivors. I don't have time to really delve into all of it, so this is just a taste of what this slide discusses. So the deaf power and control wheel, we're talking about isolation. If a survivor has a family and they're in the community and they end up having to move away from the family because they're isolated, and if they believe that people aren't caring for them or not watching them, this can be an issue. So perpetrators, they don't want to have, they want to make sure the perpetrators don't have access to them. And oftentimes it's difficult to get a deaf or a signing counselor or make reports to the police. And how this actually applies to deaf survivors, it's been difficult. It's difficult as a child. Suppose as a deaf person with an intellectual delay. And there are many different layers and facets that can lead to isolation. One of the other parts of the slide were minimizing, denying, and blaming. And one example would be the perpetrator maybe making comments and talking about the survivor and saying, oh, you're fine, you're fine. This is private information, it's part of our culture, and that's really not true. And that makes the survivor feel like it's their fault and basically gaslighting the survivor. So if some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the term gaslight, which leads to the survivor just having low self-esteem, feeling bad about themselves, and they might not have had access to this information. And maybe they don't know exactly what the perpetrator's been saying, but it's being talked about them. Using children. So in domestic or sexual violence, obviously, sometimes you see that there's an issue that the violence happens within a relationship. And you can see that sometimes children are affected, whether it's the parents are deaf or hearing, it's still a difficult situation. If they're deaf parents, they could be afraid that if the perpetrator is hearing, they could be afraid to go to court with that. And they're afraid that maybe somebody might take the child away from them if they make this report. And these are things that have happened. And a lack of resources in the deaf community is a barrier as well. Most of these shelters, domestic violence shelters, focus on hearing individuals only. And so if a deaf person goes into this type of a shelter, they don't know what's going to be happening in that shelter. So that leads to more fear. And hearing privilege. I'm sure people are aware of the term male privilege, white privilege, educational privilege. There's also something called hearing privilege. This might be a new concept for some of you, but hearing privilege looks like, well, it might not be something that you can see, but if it's a hearing or deaf partner or partnership, or a deaf child, hearing parents and deaf children, there are so many different components of deaf and hearing folks that can be connected together. People could be excluded from conversations, from financial situations, social skills, more isolation. And these are recurring situations that happen for domestic and sexual assault survivors. If the police are called and the perpetrator is still there, the police might go ahead and speak with the perpetrator if they're hearing and ignore the deaf person that's there, the deaf survivor, who just went through the most traumatic experience. But oftentimes the survivor is ignored by the police because they might not be properly trained on how to work with a deaf person, and they might not be sure what to do. And this leads to a lot of assumptions. This leads to them trying to lip read them. And sometimes the police will see the survivor, and if they have a cochlear implant, they'll assume, oh, okay, you can hear, you can understand me. And that comes back to a lack of training and the police not being aware on how to work with people in the deaf community. And oftentimes they just end up speaking to the perpetrator. And so this happens a lot, and we see a lot of gaps in understanding and in training and in cultural sensitivity. So that's definitely an example of hearing privilege.
And now I'm going to talk about coercion and threats. This is something that we see often as well. And it happens with people who are deaf and people who are not deaf, right? People who experience sexual violence are often concerned about their reputation in their community. And also victims are often blamed for what has occurred. In the deaf community, what is unique is the small nature of the community. We're talking about 300 to 500,000 people who use sign language in the country. So it means everybody knows everybody else. So there's a heightened concern about embarrassment, shame, stigma within the deaf community for survivors of sexual assault experiences, especially for people who are well known in the community. They may be very concerned about the impact on their status or their reputation within their community. So everything I just said, I know is a lot. Keep that in the back of your minds because it all relates to systemic barriers to services and reporting. So there are so many misperceptions in the society that we live in about deaf people. It is a linguistic minority that experiences oppression and is very disempowered in our society. So I don't think hearing people intentionally oppress deaf people, I don't think it's intentional. I think it's coming from a lack of awareness or a lack of knowledge, sometimes sympathy or pity. So people aren't with bad intentions. It's just that they don't know better. But the impact on the deaf community is that deaf individuals feel disrespected, demeaned, left out, and oppressed because they don't have communication access and the ability to be involved in an equitable way in many of the systems that they become involved with, whether it be rape crisis centers, law enforcement, and other evaluators and treatment providers. This awareness about how to work with the deaf community is essential. People need to understand where to find the appropriate information, what is okay, what is not okay, and people need to understand information around the vulnerability of this community and not treat people like they're incapable. Understand that they may bring internalized oppression to the situation and feel disempowered. So it's a community that has historically faced so many barriers that we all as a society and as service providers need to know how to dismantle these barriers and come from a place of empowerment and respect, so that we don't continue to perpetuate these horrible offenses to this vulnerable community and provide the support that people really need. There are a variety of communication preferences that you will see with deaf survivors. So again, we need to avoid making assumptions. You don't assume people will lip read, don't assume every deaf person knows sign language, like I mentioned before. So there are many options. Someone might use speech and lip reading to some extent. They may use American Sign Language. There's also something called pro-tactile that is used by deaf-blind individuals. So some deaf-blind people do use American Sign Language, but they don't have full access to the visual components of the language if they're using it in a tactile form. So pro-tactile is a way to add the visual cues into a way that is tactile, that it can be accessed by a deaf-blind person. So, and also on this list is written communication. So it's really important that you ask the individual who has a disability what their accommodation needs are and what their preferences are. Like I said, really turn the tables and put the onus on you as the service provider instead of on them as the survivor or client. So if you're approached by an individual and they say they need a sign language interpreter, don't say, oh, we don't need to provide an interpreter. We can just write back and forth instead. That is not an acceptable accommodation. So this is something that's important to respect, that people have different needs and preferences when it comes to communication. Here is some different technology that you might see used to communicate. Some are used by some individuals, and others are used by other individuals. Again, there's no one size fits all. You see a TTY here, that's the teletypewriter on the left. And it just looks like a little typing device. It has a keyboard. And it's very antiquated technology that not very many people use anymore. But the reason I included this on my slide is, unfortunately, the state and federal guidelines still specify TTYs as being legally required, even though it's not currently the technology being used by the deaf community. So that language in our statutes is really out of date. So agencies are still required by law to provide TTYs, but deaf people aren't using TTYs anymore. Deaf people are using video phones. But the way you use a TTY, just so you're aware, is you type your message, and then the other person on the other end who also has the TTY types their message, and you type back and forth. And then there's another type of telephone that's a captioned telephone, where a deaf person will type or speak their message if they have speech that they can use on the phone. But then when you speak back, they read what you're saying in the English captions. So again, those two pieces of technology aren't nearly as common anymore as video phones. That is what is currently being used in the community. And it's not all that different from what we've all been used to with Zoom. It's face-to-face conversation through screens where people have access to 24/7 interpreting services called video relay service. And so if you contact a deaf person, you can use your regular telephone. And when you dial their number, if it's registered as a video phone number, it will automatically be routed through an interpreting services. You won't even notice anything different. A TTY, though, has a different relay service that needs to be accessed by dialing 711. So these are some examples of telecommunications devices. So we have video phone technology, caption telephones, and TTYs. The caption phone are for those who can't hear but do speak. Oftentimes these are people who are non-signers, and so they'll speak to you, but when you speak back to them, they might not be able to hear well enough to understand you. So it's reinforced with the visual screen that has a caption version of what's being said. So these are some examples of technology used by the deaf and hard of hearing community, depending on their individual communication needs and what works best for them. I mentioned this already, but let me talk again about relay services. So the 711 relay service is for TTY users specifically, and video relay services can be accessed automatically just by using the phone like you always do. No special number is required. And again, this outlines various assistive devices because people do have varying methods of communication depending on the individual. Some people have hearing aids and use residual hearing. A very common issue is that if you see someone with a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, oftentimes people jump to the conclusion that that person can therefore fully access communication through speech and lip reading and hearing. That might not be true. So there are some deaf people who use hearing aids to hear environmental sounds or to enjoy music. So there might be very limited benefits from wearing a hearing aid, but some people choose to wear them, but it doesn't mean that it's useful for hearing speech and helping with communication. So keep that in mind. Here we have Braille displays. So this is technology used by people who are deaf and blind, where it translates into Braille what people are saying, similar to speech to text technology, but with Braille output capabilities. So again, this is technology used by people who are blind, as is canes and guide dogs. And smartphones are very useful as well for people. So again, let me go back to canes. Just like hearing aids don't mean deaf people can always speak and lip read and communicate that way, canes don't mean that someone can't see anything, that someone is completely blind. So the same is true for vision loss. It really does depend on the individual. I mentioned smartphones. Everybody knows what that is. We all have one, but there are a variety of apps that the members of the deaf community use. So the VRS, video relay service, like Sorensen is a very common one. People do have apps in their phones for that kind of access. Now, this is a list of technology used in face-to-face situations. ASL interpreting, we have a good example of that happening today. So I'm using sign language. The interpreter is putting that into spoken English for your access, and then it works the other way. If somebody was using spoken English, the interpreter would sign what they're saying in American Sign Language and function as a communication bridge in that way. So it's helpful to be aware of what works well using interpreters. Also, do keep in mind that sometimes a deaf individual may be a new arrival in the United States from a different country, And you might see the usage of certified deaf interpreters, which basically is a deaf person who is specially trained to assist with communication needs of a deaf person who may not be fully fluent in American Sign Language because they came from another country or because they might have an intellectual disability or delay that affects their language fluency and access. I mentioned protactile before. That's a method of communication used by deaf-blind people, and there are interpreters who are specially trained in protactile and have that skill set. Often video relay or video remote interpreting, VRI, is used, which is bringing in an iPad or a screen and accessing interpreting services that way. Often there are technology issues and glitches that can really impede communication. So if you have an individual, a survivor, going through a SANE appointment, SANE, having that assessment, you really want to bring in a live interpreter and not rely on VRI or video remote interpreting, because that is not a good fit typically for that situation. You can have connectivity issues, and it just adds a barrier and creates more effort and hard work for the deaf person to communicate effectively through an interpreter on a screen. So you may encounter a deaf individual who needs a different type of access. Maybe they don't use sign language and they want to see a captioned readout of what's being said. That's referred to as CART, or communication access real-time translation. And so again, that's about live captioning. And it's important to understand there are so many different individuals who have varying needs and preferences when it comes to communication access. So respect those differences and ask the individual. Here are some helpful tips. Be aware of the importance of eye contact, facial expressions, body language, and physical touch is a cultural norm. To get each other's attention, we tap each other on the arm. So that type of physical contact is not unusual for deaf people. You can wave or tap to get their attention. And context clues are really helpful when you're trying to communicate. If someone is lip reading, if they know what you're talking about, that really cuts down the guesswork. So context clues is helpful. So again, it depends on the individual. They might prefer a physical tap to get their attention, or you might call their name and they may have residual hearing where they prefer that and they can hear you well enough for that to be effective. So be patient and respectful, even if it gets, might be a little bit frustrating or stressful. It's important to maintain that patience. Also, just because it might be logistically difficult and take time to make arrangements for a sign language interpreter, that's not a reason not to do it. And while you're waiting for an interpreter to arrive, make sure the deaf person isn't left out. Figure out an alternative backup mode temporarily, whether it be writing back and forth, having a one-on-one conversation to let them know what's going on. They've experienced so much frustration, possibly trauma and violence. We don't know what they've been through. So if they're emotional and upset, it might be awkward for you where it's hard to know how to respond. But the most important thing that I can stress for you to take away from my talk today is to be patient and calm. And remember, these are human beings. So don't make assumptions and do your best. Don't assume that you know what they need. Really make time and take effort to ask them and find out.
Again, I mentioned we have interpreters for this webinar, which is wonderful. And there is interpreter use and etiquette that you should be aware of. You never want to talk directly to the interpreter. You want to make sure you're talking to the deaf person, because that's who you're working for. You're not working with the interpreter. You're working with the survivor or the client. So make sure you're engaging with the deaf person and don't say, tell her or tell him XYZ. You speak directly to the deaf person and in a normal pace, and you say you or your other person's name, and don't say he or she or tell him or her. And just pronunciate your words as normal. You don't have to over pronunciate, speak normally, and don't assume that the interpreter will filter anything out. If you say something, the interpreter will interpret it. So if you want to have a side conversation, the interpreter will be interpreting the side conversation. So you have to be careful. If you don't want to have something interpreted, take that outside. And so oftentimes the interpreter might have to ask for clarification. It's part of the interpreting process, and you just have to be patient with that. And it doesn't matter if the interpreter is using sign language or if the interpreter is using spoken language. There's always going to be a little bit of lag time or delay from the source language to the translation and to the production of the next language. So there's a little bit of a delay, which is also normal. And sometimes if I stop signing and the interpreter is still speaking, it might be a little bit awkward, but that is a normal part of the process. Oftentimes there are two interpreters instead of one. As you can see, they switch off from time to time because it's physically and mentally exhausting. So if it's a meeting or an appointment for an hour, there might be one interpreter. If it's over an hour, you might have two interpreters so they can switch back and forth together and make sure that all the communication needs are met and that we have smooth communication access. So the interpreter is there just to interpret the message between the two parties or between the party. They are neutral. They do not interject any opinion, and they're there to interpret what's going on in the environment. So oftentimes during a meeting, if there's an interpreter, people say, oh, my daughter or my son is interested in sign language and want to become an interpreter. But please be mindful of that, especially if you're in front of a survivor who's gone through a traumatic experience, that this sidebar comment with the interpreter is really not appropriate. And the appointment that you're there for is for the survivor. So just be aware of that. And how can you become an ally? Well, you can always ask what communication approach they prefer. And if the person says, I'd rather wait for an interpreter, then you should honor that and go ahead with that. But always ask what they prefer. And you can ask if there are any other preferred communication approaches. And you can always ask the survivor what other services they need. And if they need to be referred to a shelter or a counselor or to a specific agency, referrals to interpreter services. It could be a host of things. So you might be going through several different referrals, and including how to request interpreters. I have a resource list here, and they can be used for domestic or sexual assault violence survivors. The Mass Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing is a statewide agency that provides interpreters and CART services for people in the Commonwealth. The acronym is MCDHH. And there's also my agency, which is Pathways for Change. We work with domestic and sexual assault, sexual violence survivors. We're called the Deaf Survivors Program. We used to be called our Deaf Survivors Center, but now we go under Deaf Survivors Program. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to provide you with more information and resources. Again, this is my contact information. I mentioned at the beginning that I would be sharing this with you again. And now we have some time left for some Q&A. If anybody has any questions, I think Charlotte mentioned that if at the beginning of the webinar, you could add questions to the Q&A. And I'm open for you asking me anything you like. So I'm done sharing my screen, I believe. Oh, I can read through the Q&A myself. Okay. So there is one question, and it says, what do you do when a survivor walks in and you can't get an interpreter that day? And there was a question about, do you have to pay for the services? Yes, the agency does have to pay for the services. You're not personally responsible for it. Your agency would be, and the deaf person, the survivor, is not, does not have to pay for the services. The ADA has held that up as a public accommodation. And so the organization or agency needs to pay for and provide the interpreter. I know that there are some, but sometimes it has to be created as a part of your budget to cover the cost of the services, but it is free for the deaf survivor. And so the second question was, what do you do when a survivor walks in and you cannot get an interpreter on that day? Well, you can say to them, I don't have an interpreter that day. And oftentimes it takes a few days to get an interpreter. So keep that in the back of your mind. But there might be other ways to communicate, writing back and forth, using VRI, video remote interpreting services. Our hotline that we have that runs 24/7. We have somebody who is fluent in sign language or a deaf person available all the time. That's it in the Q&A. Oh, there's something in the chat right now. Oh, it's just a comment. It's not a question. I'll wait a few more minutes and see if anybody else has anything come to mind that they'd like to ask. Let's see, other question. Does it have to be related to sexual violence to reach out to you if you can't get an interpreter? Well, somebody can always reach out if they need help with something, and they can contact our agency. And we might, if they're looking for resources, we might be able to refer them to specific resources. But always engage with them, always engage with the person, and we're happy to help to facilitate anything during the process. So I know I've covered a lot today, and there's a kind of a heavy topic, and it's very multi-layered between language deprivation, systemic barriers to service, deaf community, deaf culture. It's really a lot to process, and it takes a while for it to sink in. So I just want to remind you who we are at the Deaf Survivors Program. Again, we cover statewide services for deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind community members and victims of domestic and sexual violence. We're always here to help. We want to make sure we are giving people the right resources and tools. And whether we're happy to work with your agency, if you're not familiar with this, to provide you with more resources and training if necessary. And my goal and the takeaway for today's training, just to empower you and educate you a little bit more in case you encounter a deaf survivor. And maybe these are things that you've never thought about. Maybe this might inspire you to take some sign language classes and just be a little bit more aware than you might have been in the past. And it's very important to empower the people that you're working with in case you meet somebody in the future. So that was my takeaway for today. And I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. So I think I'm going to turn it back over to Charlotte. Oh, just one more thing. Oh, something just popped up into the Q&A. If an individual has experienced sexual assault in the past and they're nervous about going to a regular doctor's appointment, such as an OB/GYN, will you send an advocate with them, even if it's not related to SANE? I would say in that situation, always reach out to us. It depends on the individual, what they want, but it's a very good question. And I would say maybe set up an appointment to speak with a counselor about that specific situation and figure out how we can best serve that person. Very good question. Thank you. And here you go, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Sabrina.
Again, thank you. Anybody can contact me anytime they want if they come up with questions later on.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. This was incredibly informative and really great resources. So Sabrina did give us permission to share.
I know it's a little overwhelming.
We will be sharing the slides and the recording of today's presentation, and I will send that to you all in a follow-up email as well. And in that email, I will also include Sabrina's contact information. That way you have it easily accessible to reach out for any other questions you may come up with, or just if you want to reach out to her as a resource if you're working with survivors who are deaf or hard of hearing. And with that, I think Brenna may have put in the chat the feedback form for today, if you don't mind taking a few minutes to fill that out. And then also a link to our Victim Rights Month workshop page, which has all of the upcoming workshops. We have a number of workshops still throughout the rest of the month. And I will include all of that information in the follow-up email again. But thank you so much, Sabrina. This was incredible and really, really great. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone in the
Well,
audience.
thank you for having me. Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.